Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about Heartbeat by Carolyn Cassady. So with this book, I would really just call it a sample of Carolyn Cassady's writing. It's not even 100 pages, it's 90 something pages long. It's very, very short because Carolyn Cassady's main work is Off the Road, which she published, I believe, in the 1990s. And this one was published in late 1970s. And it's just a sample of her writing style and her life because it takes place during the years 1952 and 1953, when she's living with both Neil Cassady and Jack Kerouac. And her book Off the Road tells the full story of that time period from when she first met Neil Cassady, through her friendship and relationship with Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. And you see the full story in that one. And this one's just a very small part. And I read this book before. This is my second time reading this book. And the last time I read it after reading Off the Road. And this time around, I'm reading this one first, and I'm going to read Off the Road after this. But last time I read this, it really I didn't get that much out of it because the events in this book are depicted pretty much identically in Off the Road. So it was kind of repetitive for me to read this afterwards. But reading it first this time, I think it took a little bit more away from it. It was definitely much more impactful on me this time. And it's interesting because this book pretty much follows the events of On the Road. On the Road wraps up around the year, I believe, 1951. He wrote it in 1951, and this book takes place starting in 1952. In this book, it talks about how he was working on revising On the Road, and he just finished writing On the Road. So the events of On the Road are very much central in these years that Carolyn Cassady writes about. And it also talks about the recordings that became Visions of Cody. Jack and Neil had a tape recorder where they would record them talking and rambling about different things. And that became the basis of the book Visions of Cody, which was at this time called Visions of Neil. And you definitely see in this book that Carolyn Cassady is really the center of Jack and Neil's friendship during this time period. She's the force that kind of draws them together in the events depicted in this book. And Jack is really the thing that made Carolyn and Neil's relationship work. He's what made their marriage work during this time period because they had a lot of issues in their marriage. Obviously, Neil Cassady caused a lot of problems in his family's life, but Jack was this outside force who came into this relationship. And you really see it kind of became this three-way marriage. It wasn't a throuple, like they weren't all in relationship together, but Carolyn had her marriage with Neil, and she also had this relationship with Jack Kerouac. And Jack Kerouac was very close friends with Neil Cassady. So it kind of became this weird three-way marriage that was just very strange and interesting. And you definitely see how the Beats really represented these norms in relationships starting to shift, which really, began to change during the 1960s. But you see the elements of that in the Beats lifestyles. And I find it interesting when they talk about, when Jack lived there, he was always bringing strange people over to the house, a lot of interesting people with interesting ideas that kind of became, they were really like these proto-hippies, just people who were very intellectual and just had very interesting ways of looking at life. And Jack brought these people over to the Cassady household. And a lot of interesting things were going on when the three of them were together. But you definitely see that this three-way marriage that they had wasn't going to last. And when you read about the Beat Generation, I think that this relationship is really this thing that you read about again and again. It was this very interesting time period where, Jack Kerouac lived with Neil Cassady, and they became this family together. But like I said before, it wasn't something that was going to last forever because Jack left their house at one point. He went to Mexico for a while. And once he left, a lot of problems started forming in Carolyn and Neil's relationship. It really wasn't what it was when, back when Jack was there. Things fell apart without him. So he became this force that kind of cemented the relationship together. And without him, it didn't really work. And he eventually comes back from Mexico, comes back to live with them again for a short period of time. And things get better again. And Carolyn Cassady talks about how everything felt right again when Jack was back. But at the same time, during that time period, you see a lot of tension starting to form between Jack and Neil. Very early on, it worked. I think Neil kind of liked having Jack there, liked having the competition with his wife. I think that was something that excited Neil. But inevitably, that formed tension. As time went on, that formed a lot of tension between the two of them. And I think after 1953, when that tension formed in the relationship, Jack and Neil's friendship was really never the same after that. It really never recovered from that see them get together again during the events of Big Sur, but you see there that there's also tension between the two of them. And I think this book really focuses on this time period where things were really at the height of Jack and Neil's friendship, but also at the same time, this is where things started to fall apart and come undone. And you definitely see in this book that Jack was always running away, always trying to go off into the sunset on some new adventure. And I think you really see how, when Jack went off to do things, you see that there was a life that he left behind. And it was this life or this relationship with Carolyn Cassady. And this is something that Jack did in many relationships that he had. He was always leaving wives, girlfriends, lovers behind. But I think this book really highlights the crossroads between two worlds. The crossroads of this 1950s household that you think of, but also this emerging counterculture, this life on the road. And I think you really see that the Beat Generation was made up of mostly just men who traveled. And they were all the core writers, were all men in the Beat Generation. But you definitely see that because it was just men that were the main figures of the Beat Generation, they were all leaving wives and lovers behind. So this is really the story of, I think, the women that the Beats left behind. These people who were just kind of thrown to the side while the men had all their adventures, and these women were just left here to suffer under, the terrible ways that these men treated them. So I think this book really demonstrates, the flip side of the Beat Generation, how, it was an era where people were going on adventures and having fun, but at the same time, people were really suffering from all this fun that these people were having. And yeah, this book's very short, not much to say about it. It's interesting because it shows the evolution of her writing. You definitely see how she was just learning how to write at this point. It was very good writing. It's not written in this very flowery kind of poetic way that Jack Kerouac or Allen Ginsberg writes, but in a sense, it's kind of refreshing just to hear just straight words, just narrative without all of this, poetic writing, just telling exactly what happened. But I do feel like in Carolyn Cassady's writing, you definitely see, I think she kind of bends the truth a little bit. She kind of writes things in the way that she wants to hear them, but it's a very clean and concise writing. I think it's very refreshing at times. You feel like, in some sense, she's just saying it how it is, even though it's how she wants it to be. It just, I think it feels like she's setting the record straight sometimes when she's writing. And because you see the evolution of her writing style, it flows very well into Off the Road. You see how she was, learning to write here, and then when she finally published Off the Road, it's written much, much better. It's a much more well put together writing. But my main criticism of this book is that there's too many excerpts of letters. There's just like pages and pages of just letters. And not so much that she's including letters, but she's using those letters to really be part of the narrative. It's like she writes about something that happens, and then she throws this letter in there that kind of connects that to another event that happened. And I'd just rather get her telling the events than her using a letter to tell what happened. And it's letters that, Jack Kerouac wrote, letters that Allen Ginsberg and Cassady wrote. And I'd just rather get her writing. I'd rather see her tell about it than have someone else tell about what happened in a letter. But that's just my take on that. But yeah, it's very short, not much to it. Would I recommend reading it? I don't know. I mean, it's definitely interesting, like I said, to see her writing style, but I'd much more rather read Off Road, because Off Road gives the full story, not just this little piece. It's pretty much identical to the portion of the book in Off Road where it talks about this time period. But yeah. Anyway, it's Heartbeat by Carolyn Cassady. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.